Welcome to our Week 3 summary for William Wordsworth Poetry, People and Place. I'm delighted to be joined this week by Andrew Raven, one of our team of mentors, and also particularly pleased to be joined by Sally Bushell today. Sally is suffering from a croaky throat and a bad cold, as you'll hear later, but she's very bravely soldiering on for all of our benefit. So this week we've been meeting near the tumultuous brook of Greenhead Gill. We've been thinking about William Wordsworth's very powerful pastoral poem, Michael. We've very much enjoyed reading your responses to the poem, as ever. Been a couple of other elements again this week, so some great contributions to the Padlet wall around the importance of place, and if you've not had a chance to look at that, we certainly recommend that you do. A great mosaic of text and some images on there too. And also Sally set for you this week a manuscript transcription task, which I think everyone, including myself, has found quite challenging. So maybe Sally will be able to say a little bit more about that later if we have time. But I'll turn then to Andrew and see what kind of week he's had as a mentor.
It's been another interesting and engaging week. Many of the participants have commented on the pathos of Michael, and we've had more reports of tears and weeping and things like that, and some very personal responses too, which is good to see. There's been some creative responses to Wordsworth, all of which I've enjoyed reading, and there's also been some very interesting discussions about biblical allusion, which leads me to our first question, which is to do with Wordsworth's religious sensibility, which is a point of contention, isn't it? Particularly amongst his contemporaries. Coleridge calls Wordsworth at least half an atheist, doesn't he? And even there, Coleridge is not quite sure how to categorise Wordsworth. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this problem.
Shall I say a bit about the general issue? You might want to say a bit about biblical allusions, maybe? So as you say, even at the time Wordsworth is writing, and even amongst his close friends, people are unsure how to categorise his belief, what exactly it is he believes in. And this is partly because, as with other elements, such as his politics, his ideas do change over time, and religiously as politically he becomes increasingly orthodox, I guess. But I think the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things for me about Wordsworth in relation to religion, is this sense that his poetry is seen to have a very strong spiritual power. So a number of contemporaries and critics pick up on this, that they feel a sense of spirituality about it, but very difficult to categorise. So I think, as you mentioned, Coleridge, Charles Lamb asked him the question, are you a Christian or what are you? And so it's quite they find his poetry hard to tie down. It doesn't seem to conform to the conventional tenets of the Church of England. Yet at the same time, the sense of spirituality is something that's appropriated in the Victorian period by a range of different beliefs. So people people including agnostics or Quakers turn to Wordsworth's poetry and sort of say, this speaks to us. So that seems to be one of the great strengths of Wordsworth, that the power of his language speaks to people across a range of different denominations and religious beliefs.
Yeah, so ultimately the fact that you can't pin him down actually becomes a major strength going forward. I think it's also worth remembering that Coleridge trained for the priesthood. Coleridge was actually going to become, a vicar. So his sense of more orthodox Christianity is much, much stronger than Wordsworth's.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you say Wordsworth is difficult to pin down. The same is true of his politics, perhaps. This is something that many learners have wanted to know more about. On the one hand, we've got the young Wordsworth advocating political violence. On the other hand, we've got the older Wordsworth, opposed to Catholic emancipation, ambivalent with regards to slavery, in favour of capital punishment, and so forth. Is this just a typical example of old age tending towards conservatism, or is something more complex going on here?
Well, I think you certainly have to see it within context. He is living in extraordinary times, and times of extraordinary actions and changes, and so to briefly rehearse that history, he's tremendously excited, I think, as we were saying in week one, by the French Revolution, when a whole new world seems possible. This inspires his famous phrase, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." So Earth is going to become like heaven at that point, a world of equality and opportunity for all. What he then lives through, in effect, is, from Revolution 1789, 1793 to 1815, he lives through wars on an unprecedented scale. To the extent, and the change is so great to the extent that by 1803, this initially advocate of the French Revolution, has become a Grasmere volunteer. He's putting on uniform and he's exercising with the volunteers, the kind of early 19th century equivalent to Dad's army, to actually fight against the French. He's ready to fight the French. And Dorothy says, I don't know a more determined hater of the French. So I think the transformation needs to be seen within that context.
Yeah, and also, remember that many of the people, young radicals who supported the revolution, when the revolution was an internal civil war of a class war, effectively, were then put in a very difficult position when that war became an aggressive war against England, and then they're split. So it's not just Wordsworth turned against his principles. He's either got to say, I support the French Revolution against my own country. He's not going to do that. And to that point, 1798, when France declares war on Britain, is a massive problem for the supporters of the revolution.
Yeah, his argument would be that his own principles never change. Yeah. It's that France changes from being, as you say, fighting wars of self-defence against oppression to fighting imperial wars led by Napoleon of aggression and empire themselves, and that he always holds strong to his own belief in liberty and in the power of the people. So part of the French wars is the Peninsular War, which is inspired by the rising of the Spanish people against Napoleon's invasion, and that is what enables Wordsworth to really realign himself with England when they support that. This sense that he is supporting a people's uprising again.
I suppose one way of getting out of that left-right dichotomy is to think about Wordsworth's ecological leanings, as later critics have described it. I wonder if you could say a bit more about eco-criticism, because a lot of our learners seem to be interested in what's at stake ecologically within Wordsworth's poetry.
Yeah. Shall I do that?
Yeah, by all means.
As you say, Andrew, some people say eco-criticism is kind of a green as opposed to a red reading of Wordsworth. Jonathan Bay writes an article with that title, and it's almost anti sort of historicist, very Marxist approach to Wordsworth, and in some ways a more positive reading of Wordsworth in relation to our own time. So eco-criticism basically just relates to how do humans relate to their environment, and as we've said in previous weeks, in week one, that kind of awakening in the second half of the 20th century of us to our responsibilities of the planet, climate change, etc., where we have a very heightened response historically. If you look back in the past, our period we're the most concerned about our responsibility towards the planet of any period, but that does have its origins in Romanticism and specifically in Wordsworth. And I said somewhere on the site, responding to someone, that the origins of the National Trust actually come from Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes. There's a great story about Guide to the Lakes, which we'll tell them because they'll like it, where Wordsworth's in a carriage travelling back to Cumbria, and he gets chatting with the person next to him, and the person next to him sort of says, William Wordsworth, you're the author of Guide to the Lakes. So they talk about this author, and then at the end of that conversation, this guy says, so have you written anything else? Which is a great account, but also tells you how popular and how important the Guide to the Lakes was. But right at the end of Guide to the Lakes, I'll just read it out because it's very influential. Wordsworth ends by anticipating the future, and he says, in this wish, the author will be joined by persons of pure taste throughout the whole island, who by their visits to the lakes in the north of England testify that they deem the district a sort of national property, in which every man has a right and interest, who has an eye to perceive and a heart to enjoy. And that description of the national property, the lakes being protected, carries right through, and then the Wordsworth Society in Hardwick, Rawnsley, sets up the National Trust as a Wordsworthian. So in the UK, there's a direct link between Wordsworth's principles of a kind of, sort of natural environment, right through to what is protecting that environment for us today.
I guess the question as well sort of takes us back to week one in a way, and the tables turned, doesn't it? And that sense of, Wordsworth is a very powerful spokesman for nature, whatever nature is. There's been much discussion about on the course, but nature is a benevolent force. Nature is something that works for good and that shapes people, including himself, for good. So I suppose that's one of the key elements in Wordsworth in relation to the ecological tradition. I suppose Michael also speaks for what Sally was sort of pointing towards there, the very close relationship with the land and the sense of value of the land and identity being tied up with the land, really. Michael is someone who can't actually live without that relationship, or can't live fully without that relationship. And then, as Sally says, Wordsworth's also been a key figure in the conservation movement. I mean, most powerfully through his own writing, his poetry, and the Guide to the Lakes, but also resisting the train line that was planned to go from Windermere all the way up through Keswick, wasn't it? Cutting through Grasmere. So he writes both poetry and newspaper articles about that. So he is a very important figure, I think, in the ecological tradition and the conservation movement.
Thank you for that. The last questions that I want to ask have a little bit more to do with manuscripts and things like that. There's been some very interesting responses to the cross-written manuscripts exercise, an exercise which is a very difficult one. Some of the questions that people have come up with in this section have to do with the ethical consequences of reading these manuscripts. Are these manuscripts intended to be read, or are we, by examining these materials, somehow breaching Wordsworth's authority or breaching his literary objectives?
Okay, so there's two different things we could put together there. So one is the ethics of Wordsworth writing over Coleridge, which I think a lot of people were upset about or engaging with in various ways. So there's the Wordsworth-Coleridge relationship. Maybe we should talk about that first, and then there's the actual larger question about manuscripts. So Wordsworth-Coleridge, lots of people feeling sorry for Coleridge. I think you do have to feel sorry for Coleridge in general, because the relationship between Wordsworth and Coleridge benefits Wordsworth much more than it does Coleridge. Coleridge has a line that I wrote down. I was reading it to Simon earlier. He says in his letters, he describes Wordsworth as a very great man, the only man to whom at all times and in all modes I feel myself inferior. And that's a very telling quotation. So basically, Coleridge does have a massive inferiority complex in relation to Wordsworth. Totally ungrounded, because I think Coleridge is an extraordinarily good poet. He's a fantastic imagination. Yeah. But he once he meets Wordsworth, that is Coleridge's poetic career at an end, really, because he just thinks he's much better than me, and he cannot get over that. And so in that context, clearly the Christabel debate, I'm sure it was damaging. It might have been very good reasons. It might have been a mutually agreed decision at that moment in time, but I'm sure it was damaging to Coleridge.
Yeah, I suppose. One of the things that strikes me is it's not one-way traffic, this relationship either. So, sure, it benefits Wordsworth to the greatest kind of degree, but it's also a problem for him, isn't it? So that in the 1790s. Coleridge is already putting pressure on Wordsworth.
Yeah.
There's a kind of displacement of responsibility from Coleridge. I'm not going to be able to do this. Yeah. You're the one who can write the great philosophical
Wordsworth
poem.
has a kind of superiority complex as well, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Because he's intimidated by the stature which Coleridge
gives him.
Gives him.
One of the things again I've really liked on the course is the way in which lots of the contributors have flagged up information around these kinds of topics. And someone identified a really good essay by the biographer and critic John Worthing, which is linked to his book The Gang, which is about the Coleridge, Wordsworth, and the rest of the circle. And so you'll find the link on that, on the site. But Worthing makes a very interesting argument for how complex this relationship is, and identifies a letter from, I think it's Coleridge to Josiah Wedgwood, in which Coleridge is saying that giving the impression that Christabel has been removed from lyrical ballads because it's too long, but it's also too good, and that actually it deserves to stand on its own 2 feet, kind of by itself. So I think there are sort of 2 sides, or more than 2 sides to the story. It's very complex, and I suppose the thing is we just don't know either, do we? What happens in that at that particular moment? Why it's removed. It remains very kind of tantalising, but they all seem to be in very good.
They prepare the body together, and I'm sure. As always with Coleridge, what happens in the moment and what he later reinterprets that as not always the same thing. I guess, your point, Andrew, that Wordsworth has to live up to it. I think that's true, and it does pressure Wordsworth. But then Wordsworth responds very positively to that pressure. So it's very different personality types. Really.
Yeah. The other thing I'd just remind people of is that Wordsworth ends the prelude with profuse thanks to Coleridge. Without you and Dorothy, I would not have been able to produce this masterpiece. And also, you're the only person who is really going to understand what I'm doing here. To thee, the work shall justify itself. There's one person out there who's going to understand this new project, and that's Coleridge. So actually, it does give Coleridge a lot of credit.
And Coleridge does get his own back in a sense later on, doesn't he, in Biography Literaria? I was just reading this morning. And Coleridge says, talking about the preface, he says, with many parts of this preface in the sense attributed to them and which the words undoubtedly seem to authorise, I never concurred, but on the contrary objected to them as erroneous in principle and as contradictory both to other parts of the same preface and to the author's own practice. So one explanation could be that Coleridge is happy to remove Christabel because he himself sees the flaws of the Lyrical Ballads project, though.
Yeah, this is 17 years after the event.
Yeah.
So the other question was about...
Yes, the other question was about manuscripts more generally.
Okay, so... I think the bottom line, Kafka, isn't it, who asks... who asks his executor to burn all his manuscripts. This is an ultimate example of this. And that person doesn't burn those manuscripts, and thus we have Kafka's manuscripts, which otherwise we wouldn't have. For me, the bottom line is, if you want to burn your manuscripts, burn your manuscripts. So many writers occupy a kind of very grey area. So they're often very modest about it, or they, as I say, Tennyson I mentioned earlier, Tennyson had a ban on, you could read his manuscripts, but you couldn't quote from his manuscripts until 1979, which is quite astonishing. And so, they're there, but they're protected, or I don't want them to be kept, but if they are, I don't read them. So it's a very shady area. At the end of the day, all of these writers want to be famous, and all of them are surely, they do value their process. From the 19th century onwards, there's a different attitude prior to that towards manuscript materials. And so I think that they find it very hard to destroy them. I don't think there is a problem. There's only a problem if, by looking at those manuscripts, if you're looking at it evaluatively to say, this poem's rubbish, oh my God, it took him 10 drafts to produce this, it's rubbish, then that would be a problem if your reading was a judgmental one that was making a negative evaluation of the poem, which of course is what they're scared of. That's why they don't want you to read it. But we're not doing that. We're actually using those materials to enhance our understanding of the final text. And I don't think there's any ethical conundrum there.
The flip side of this, in a way, is when things get destroyed that you wish had survived. Perhaps the most famous one from the Romantic period being Byron's memoirs. So Byron writes the memoirs of his life, a lot of which otherwise we don't know the full details of. And then his executors, who include, I think, Walter Scott and Thomas More, two of the poets, and his publisher, John Murray, burn the memoirs in the fireplace of John Murray, the publisher's house in Albemarle Street, because they're so scandalous. You know, so that's the other side. You know, someone writing for posthumous publication and people deeming this not fit to be published for whatever reason.
But there's also always a sort of kind of pleasing accidentality, I don't know what the word would be, you know, to manuscripts as well. So Emily Dickinson, a great example, you know, she's just got them all in the bottom drawer of her commode, not commode, what do you call those things that you draw the drawers out? And no one even knows they're there until she dies and they suddenly discover all this extraordinary wealth. So there's something quite pleasing about that too, that they are material objects and they're subject to chance.
Chest of drawers, is that the technical term?
There's a particular chest of drawers that come on.
Okay, well that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for asking the questions, for your contributions through the week as well. I know people have been, people have been remarking on how much they value the work that you and the other mentors are doing. So thanks again for that. Thanks again to Sally for bravely soldiering on, as is her way, despite her illness. Hopefully, when we're back next week, we'll all have full voices. I'm certainly hoping that I don't lose mine. And so next week we're going to be, I know it's a week lots of you have been looking forward to, because we're going to be looking in more detail the writing of William's sister, Dorothy Wordsworth. And our colleague, Professor Sharon Ruston, will be taking you on a guided tour of Dove Cottage. So we'll actually be entering Dove Cottage for the first time. So we look forward to seeing you all then.